On the afternoon of September 4th, 1939, the sky over Heligoland Bight was heavily overcast. A stiff nor'wester drove the rain clouds low over the North Sea against the German coastline. Sometimes they were down to only 300 feet above the waves. Within this confined space, a group of heavy twin-engine aircraft were droning eastward. 5 of them, followed at some distance by another 5. In this weather, the markings on their wings and fuselages were all but indistinguishable. They were not, however, German machines, but British, 10 Bristol Blenheims, the fastest bombers of the Royal Air Force. On the day following their country's declaration of war, they had come to make the first attack. The weather in the Heligoland Bight was bloody, writes Squadron Leader K.C. Doran, who led the way with the first 5 aircraft from 110 Squadron. A solid wall of cloud seemed to extend from sea level to about 17,000 feet. We obviously had to keep below it to stand any chance of finding our target, so we went down to sea level. It was a worthwhile target. In the morning, a reconnaissance plane had spotted a number of German warships in the Schillig Roads outside Wilhelmshaven and off Brunsbüttel in the Elbe estuary. But the radio message that reached England was very distorted, and it was decided to wait, however impatiently, for the reconnaissance pilot's return. At last, towards noon, he touched down at Whiten Airfield. The photographs he brought back confirmed his report. The battle cruisers Gneisenau and Scharnhorst were in the Elbe, and the pocket battleship Admiral Scheer, with cruisers and destroyers, in the Schillig Roads. Bomber Command decided to strike at once, but it could not be done that quickly. Owing to the weather, the only possible attack was a low-level one, but the Blenheims were loaded with semi-armor-piercing bombs, and these would only penetrate if dropped from a height. Doran adds, so off came the 500-pound SAP, and on went 500-pound GP with 11-second delay fuse. The war was only 24 hours old, but already the bomb load had been changed 4 times. At last the machines were ready. Only the best pilots were allowed to fly. 5 Blenheims of 110 Squadron and 5 of 107 left Wattisham for this leap in the dark. Another 5 took off from Whiten, but these lost their way, and after flying around for some hours, returned with their mission unaccomplished. Doran, meanwhile, flew on eastwards at the head of his 5 Blenheims, doggedly changing course when the time calculated to reach the predetermined turning point had elapsed. Visibility was virtually nil as the Blenheims now pushed south towards the German coast. Once outpost patrol boats appeared like phantoms through the murk, and at once were lost to sight again. And then suddenly the coast loomed ahead. Doran studied his map and made comparisons. To starboard the islands, with the mainland behind, and somewhat to port a deep inlet. It was the mouth of the Jade. They were exactly on course to Wilhelmshaven, right on target. An incredible combination of luck and judgment was his assessment. Within a few minutes, cloud base lifted to 500 feet, and we saw a large merchant ship. No, it was the Admiral Scheer. At once the formation broke up. The first 3 Blenheims formed into line ahead, and with short intervals between them, flew straight for the German battleship. The 4th and 5th machines broke away to port and starboard and climbed briefly into cloud. They were to attack the ship from either side and disperse the enemy defensive fire. The German flak was to be given no time to consider which of the 5 aircraft to engage first. So, at least, was the plan the British had worked out. A lightning attack on their victim from all sides by 5 Blenheims and at mast height, and all within 11 seconds. For after 11 seconds, their bombs were timed to go off, and if by then the last Blenheim was not clear, it might be hit by the bomb explosions of the first. On paper, the plan was good. In practice, it was of course subject to a few small but decisive changes. The Admiral Scheer lay at anchor in Schillig Roads. On board, the crew went about their normal duties. High above, on the foremast platform, stood the flak operations officer. Together with a Luftwaffe officer, he had just been going through the aircraft recognition tables. All at once, a loudspeaker came to life. "Message from port watch to quarterdeck flak MG, Herr Captain Lieutenant. 3 aircraft at 6 o'clock." The lieutenant looked astern through his binoculars. 3 dark dots were rapidly approaching the ship. It was against orders. The lieutenant shook his head angrily. How often must one tell these Luftwaffe fellows to keep their distance from all warships? If not, the flak crews would get nervous and shoot another one of them down. Suddenly, the Luftwaffe officer beside him exclaimed, "They aren't ours! They're British Blenheims!" Within seconds, the air raid alarm bells jangled through the ship. Doran writes, "We saw the Matlows washing hanging out around the stern and the crew idly standing about on deck. However, when they realized our intention was hostile, they started running about like mad." Before a shot could be fired, the first bomber was on them. Just missing the mast, it screamed diagonally over the afterdeck. 2 heavy bombs crashed onto the ship. One dug itself in and came to rest. The other bounced along the deck, then rolled overboard into the water. No explosion. Then at last the flak began firing angrily at the retreating Blenheim. Almost at once the second was upon them with the same results as the first. One bomb plummeted into the sea with a great fountain of water just a few yards from the gunwale. An especially dangerous spot for a delayed action bomb, for it could work like a mine and hold the ship deep below the waterline. But now at Schillig Roads, all hell had broken loose. Over a wide area, lines of tracer laced the air, as over 100 flak barrels, from the ships and from the numerous batteries ashore, concentrated their fire on each aircraft as it dived out of cloud. The third Blenheim didn't reach the Scheer, but broke sharply away some 100 yards short because, according to Doran, it couldn't be on target within the prescribed 11 seconds. Its bomb splashed harmlessly into the water. The same applied to the fourth and fifth, except that one of them, riddled with flak, burst into flames and crashed into the sea close to the bird sanctuary island of Melham. These 5 Blenheims of 107 Squadron fared worse. Attacking somewhat later than Doran's 110 Squadron, they bore the whole brunt of the now fully alerted defenses. Only one of them returned. The others were all shot down. As one Blenheim fell, it crashed sideways into the bows of the cruiser Emden, tearing a large hole and causing the war's first casualties in the German Navy. That was for the British the only positive result of this surprise and certainly most courageous attack. What about the strikes on the Admiral Scheer with the 11 second bombs? The vest pocket battleship, as the English called the Scheer class, was lucky. None of the bombs exploded. 3 hits, 3 duds. A simultaneous attack by 14 Vickers Wellington bombers on the 2 largest warships lying off Brunsbüttel in the Elbe estuary also miscarried. The ship's iron ring of anti-aircraft fire was virtually impenetrable. One Wellington crashed in flames, another fell to a German fighter, for though the weather could scarcely have been less favorable for fighter operations, a fighter Group A, Major Harry von Bülow's 2 JG-77 nonetheless took off from Nordholz. Sergeant Alfred Held's Me-109 took the Wellington by surprise before its pilot could reach cloud cover. It was the first German fighter victory over a British bomber in World War II. Soon afterwards, Sergeant Troitz of the same Group A brought down a Blenheim. For British Bomber Command, the result of this September 4th operation was a grave disappointment. Its hopes of striking a heavy blow at the German fleet at the very outset of the war had been frustrated. Virtually nothing had been achieved, at heavy cost. Of the 24 bombers that set out, 7 failed to return, and many of the rest suffered various degrees of damage. The Royal Air Force, wrote the official British Admiralty historian Captain Roskill, was anxious to put its theories about the deadly effect of bombing attacks on warships to the test. The failure of these raids was a sharp rejoinder to those who had so confidently predicted that air power had made large surface warships obsolete. On the German side, things were much the same. During these first weeks and months of the war, there were, between RAF and Luftwaffe, a lot of parallels. Both were under orders to wage war, as it were, with velvet gloves, with the following specific negatives. No bombs to be dropped on enemy territory. No enemy civilians to be harmed. No merchant ships to be attacked. No flying over neutral countries. Thus, for both air forces, the only legitimate targets left were enemy warships on the open sea or in the roadstead. As soon as they were in harbor, docked, or moored against a pier, they too must be left unmolested. Apart from the fact that neither side wanted to take the blame for starting indiscriminate bombing, the Germans had another plausible reason for hanging back. Hitler believed that Britain would soon see reason and be ready for peace, a mood that would surely be changed by German air raids. Furthermore, the Luftwaffe must first have done with the Polish campaign before it could gather its strength for an offensive against the West. The British government of the time has often been charged with failing in September 1939 to exploit the two-way front that Germany then faced. Concentrated air attacks on strong points in northwest Germany would certainly have compelled Göring to withdraw a large proportion of the Luftwaffe from Poland, thus appreciably alleviating that country's military position. The inertia and weakness of our politicians were a godsend for the Luftwaffe, was the verdict of the British air war expert Derek Wood in a work published in 1961. But the War Cabinet under Chamberlain stuck to its resolve: no bombs on Germany unless the Germans started dropping them on England. The official history, Royal Air Force 1939 to 1945, has a quite simple and sober explanation. At the end of September 1939, Bomber Command's frontline strength was only 33 squadrons, totaling 480 aircraft. Since the British credited their opponents with 3 times this number, all-out action was obviously against our interests until a more satisfactory balance of forces could be achieved. With expediency reinforcing the dictates of humanitarianism, the measures open to Bomber Command were accordingly those which could be carried out under the policy of conserving and expanding the bomber force until we were at liberty to take the gloves off. In Germany in September 1939, there was a man whose hands were similarly tied. This was Lieutenant General Hans Ferdinand Geisler, who with his staff had taken over the Hamburg Air Administrative Command, situated at Blankenese in Mantafelstrasse. Geisler was in charge of the newly formed 10 Air Division, whose main task was to wage war on Britain's seaborne forces. Even if Göring's strict instructions had not forbidden Geisler to start any action against Britain itself, it was quite impossible for him to do so, for at the moment he hardly possessed a single bomber. His only Geschwader, KG-26, still in the process of formation, had been transferred to Poland. Though by mid-September the so-called Lion Geschwader was back at its operational bases on Heligoland Bight, it consisted at first of only 2 Gruppen comprising some 60 H-111s. Most of its pilots and squadron commanders, like the CO himself, Colonel Hans Seeburg, had previously belonged to the Navy. The German Navy's CNC, Admiral Erich Raeder, had agreed to recommend the transfer of his airmen to the Luftwaffe with a heavy heart. For years, the two services had disputed as to which should have the conduct of air operations over the sea, and finally, Göring's maxim, "Everything that flies belongs to me," had won the day. All that the Fleet Air Arm was left with were a few coastal formations equipped with reconnaissance and shipboard planes. In pursuance of his resolve that the air-sea war should be conducted by the Luftwaffe, Göring promised in November 1938 that he would have 13 Bombergeschwader ready for this role by 1942. Any earlier war with Britain, Hitler had positively assured him, could be ruled out. This would stop any drain on the rest of the bomber force. Compared with this splendid assertion, the actual force available at the outset of hostilities, just the two Gruppen of KG-26, was modest indeed. To be sure, Luftwaffe 2, North, under Air General Helmut Felmy, did get one other bomber unit early in September. It was then called Experimental Group 88, and it was the first to be equipped with a plane that the Luftwaffe hoped would achieve a decisive technical breakthrough, the Junkers Ju-88 Wonder Bomber. However, neither Felny nor his chief of staff, Colonel Kalmhuber, fancied throwing a unit that was still under training with mechanically unproven aircraft straight into war operations. Though it had meanwhile been renamed 1/KG-30, they posted it away again from Jever to the airfields of Hagenow-Land and Grieswald in Mecklenburg and Pomerania. Its CO, Captain Poli, reported, just one section under Lieutenant Walter Storp remained on standby at Westerland on the island of Sylt. General Felmy told me that it would be employed at the next appearance of the British fleet. My suggestion that he forthwith use the whole group for this purpose was declined. Luftwaffe 2 then extended its warning to the High Command in Berlin. The new Ju-88 should not be put into operation in dribs and drabs, but only when it could make itself felt. Let the first attack be at least a complete Geschwader, at least 100 aircraft. Göring and his chief of staff, Jeschonek, turned deaf ears. This business of the Ju-88 and its readiness or non-readiness had been going on for too long. 2 years ago, in 1937, it had been heralded as an unarmed bomber fast enough to elude any fighter aircraft. Then, after all, it had been equipped with a defensive armament. And after that had come the demand for a dive potential like that of the Stuka. Always new requests resulting in new problems and fresh delays in production. The aircraft had been supposedly ready for series production on September 3, 1938. On that date, the Junkers firm received its contract. Its Director General, Dr. Heinrich Koppenberg, received from Göring a comprehensive mandate that concluded, "I want a powerful force of Ju-88 bombers in the shortest possible time." Since then, a year had elapsed and the war had started, but the Ju-88s in the hands of the Luftwaffe still numbered fewer than 50. The Supreme Commander decided that the machine had been doctored enough. It was high time it proved itself. The Wonder Bomber must achieve a success to establish its prestige. Late in the afternoon of September 26th, the telephone rang in the office of Captain Poli, 1/KG-30's commander at Grieswald. Jeschonek himself was on the line. "Congratulations, Poli. Your section at Westerland has sunk the Ark Royal." Poli knew the Chief of General Staff too well after a long period of working with him not to recognize the ironic undertone. "I don't believe it." "I don't believe it either," answered Jeschonek. "But the iron one, Göring, does. Fly to Westerland right away and find out what's true and what isn't." Who had reported the sinking? Was it 10 Air Division who had directed the operation against the flotilla? What had really happened? On the morning of September 26th, Naval Group West had sent out its long-range reconnaissance planes over the North Sea prior to a destroyer operation on the following day. They were D-18 flying boats of the Coastal Squadron 2/106 based on Norderney. Towards 10:45, one of these was north of the Great Fisher Bank. Its observer suddenly started. Through a gap in the clouds, he had just sighted a warship. No, it wasn't. It was a whole fleet. Again and again, the D-18 circled the solitary cloud gap, while the pilot and observer feverishly counted up the great naval units, 4 battleships, an aircraft carrier, plus cruisers and destroyers. Down below them sailed the British home fleet. The precise wording of the D-18's radio signal electrified the German coastal staffs. Here at last was the long-awaited chance to attack, practically the only chance, within the scope of the existing orders, to hit the enemy at all. Shortly after 11, the telephones were already jangling at the bomber base on Sylt. Operation Order, Map Square 4022, long-range reconnaissance in contact with enemy, attack with 1,000-pound bombs. The British flotilla did in fact consist of the battleships Nelson and Rodney, the battle cruisers Hood and Renown, the aircraft carrier Ark Royal, and 3 cruisers. Not far off lay the 2nd Cruiser Squadron with 4 more cruisers and 6 destroyers. The force that was sent to attack this armada was modest indeed. At 12:50, 9 H-111s of the Lion-Geschwader, that is, No. 1 Squadron of KG-26, took off under Captain Vetter. 10 minutes later, these were followed by the Readiness Section of the Eagle-Geschwader, the 4 Ju-88s under Lieutenant Storp, which now had the chance of proving its worth. That was all that 10 Air Division could or would muster. There, far away from its bases and shadowed by German reconnaissance planes, stood the bulk of the British home fleet at sea, and the Luftwaffe exploited its opportunity with a mere 13 bombers. Low down below the clouds, the 4 Ju-88s chased each other northwestwards. This, they hoped, would be the quickest way to find the enemy once they had reached his given position. Pilot of the 3rd machine was a Corporal Karl Frank, known to his comrades as Beaver Frank because of his well-kept beard. By next morning, his name was to be on everybody's lips. Frank was in fact a certified engineer and aircraft technician. He knew the Ju-88 well, having been in charge of its technical trials at Rechlin. But apart from that, he was a dedicated flyer. In 1937, at an air concourse at Zurich, where world experts held their breath at the incredible speed of the German aircraft, he had already joined UDIT in demonstrating a Me-109 tuned for maximum performance. Just before the war, he had volunteered as a pilot in his friend Pohl's test team, rather than be stuck forever at Rechlin. So it happened that, as a mere corporal, he was now flying one of the first 4 Ju-88s ever to take part in an offensive action. After a flight of a bare 2 hours, the ships came into view ahead. Frank pulled through cloud up to 9,000 feet. Cloud density was about 8/10, affording only an occasional glimpse of the sea below. Then suddenly, through a gap, a great ship appeared, the aircraft carrier. Without hesitation, Frank flicked over and dived steeply down on the target. Not a gun opened fire. He must have taken the ship completely by surprise. Then a cloud bank masked his vision, and when he was through it, the carrier was no longer in his bomb sight. Impossible to correct the dive. He knew the plane too well and what its diving limits were. He was aiming too much to the side. There was only one thing to do: pull out and start again. But now the ship's anti-aircraft defenses were at last letting fly. If only he had aimed right the first time, he could have pressed home his attack virtually without opposition. Frank waited 8 minutes, then dived again, this time into a hail of flak. But now he was properly lined up. The carrier was fixed in his bomb sight like a spider in its web. A press on the button and the bombs fell. Immediately, the automatic pull-out operated and he was back in a climb. While Frank concentrated in avoiding action to get out of the flak, his radio operator and tail gunner kept their eyes glued on the carrier below. Suddenly, Sergeant Bevermeyer shouted, "Water fountain, hard beside the ship!" Even Frank risked a glance downwards. There was a big spout of water close to the gunwale. And then came a flash on the bows. Was this a hit, or just the flash of a heavy flak gun? If the latter, what had happened to the second bomb, automatically released just after the first? The ship was now too far away to observe any further details. Anyway, that was not their job. They were thankful to have gotten away from the flak with whole skins. The crew's radio report sounded guardedly optimistic. Dive attack with 2 SC-500 bombs on an aircraft carrier. First, a near miss by ship's side. Second, a possible hit on bows. Effect not observed. Hardly had Frank landed back at Westerland when the cheering started. Only the Lion-Geschwader's commander, Colonel Seeberg, was skeptical. "Did you actually see her sink?" "No, Colonel." "In that case, my dear fellow," Seeberg grinned, "you didn't hit her either." As a former naval officer, Seeberg knew from experience that a flash or even drifts of smoke from an enemy ship were by no means conclusive evidence of a strike by one's own guns, but of course the Luftwaffe were not to know this. Meanwhile, the wires at 10 Division HQ were burning. Full of impatience, the CINC Luftwaffe in Berlin wanted to know why no report had been sent of the sinking of the British aircraft carrier. "Because nothing about such a sinking is known here," signaled the divisional operations officer, Major Martin Harlinghausen. Truly, all he had in his possession was Frank's carefully worded report, which he at once passed on to Berlin. But once started, the mischief continued. A reconnaissance patrol was sent out to discover what had happened to the Ark Royal. Finally, toward 1700 hours, came the first report. Enemy flotilla in Square X, 2 battleships and covering vessels, full speed, course west. The aircraft carrier had disappeared. In Berlin, no one hit on the obvious explanation that the formation had split up and that the Ark Royal was now proceeding with the section which the patrol had not sighted. A new order was dispatched over the radio: "Look out for oil patches." Shortly afterwards, even a suitable oil patch was found, overlooking the fact that the North Sea is studded with them. Was this not enough proof that the Ark Royal and its 60 aircraft now lay on the bed of the ocean? Göring, Milch, and Jesenek debated whether after all it might be advisable to await for the British to make some announcement. But German propaganda had already got its teeth into the affair. German Luftwaffe sinks Britain's latest aircraft carrier. And with a single bomb, it was a windfall. When Captain Pohl, in obedience to Jesenek's order, landed at Westerland late in the evening, Corporal Frank forgot all about military discipline. "Pohl, old boy," he cried excitedly to his commanding officer, "there's not a word of truth in it. For God's sake, help me get out of this frightful mess." But Pohl was too late to arrest the momentum. Next day, the German High Command published its report of the attack on the British fleet. It read, "Apart from the destruction of an aircraft carrier, a number of hits were scored on a battleship. All our aircraft returned safely." Even Göring now added his official seal. He sent his personal congratulations to Frank, promoted the corporal to lieutenant with immediate effect, and decorated him with the Iron Cross Grades 1 and 2. The British Admiralty countered. It announced dryly, the aircraft carrier Ark Royal, which the Germans reported to have sunk, had returned undamaged to its base. It even issued to the press a picture of her entering the same. This, according to German propaganda, was a trick, a vain attempt by the English to hide the severity of their loss. On September 28th, even the High Command took issue with the tendentious British announcement, confirming that a 1,000-pound bomb had hit the carrier. Its new report, however, no longer contained the words destroyed, sunk, or annihilated, but the German press still persisted with the full story. The fact of the matter is that at the beginning of October, the Ark Royal steamed to the South Atlantic, there to take part in the month-long hunt for the German raider Admiral Graf Spee. Only after the British aircraft carrier was finally torpedoed and sunk in the Mediterranean on November 14, 1941, by the U-boat U-81, were German reports about its previous sinking quietly altered. One bomb from the remaining 3 Ju-88s of IKG-30 did hit the hood, but was a dud and bounced off. IKG-26 attacked the cruiser squadron, but all their bombs missed their targets. The Luftwaffe chiefs in Berlin did not have to wait so long for the truth, It dawned on the General Staff the next day. So it was that both Luftwaffe and the RAF were greatly disappointed by their first efforts to assail each other's fleets. Something had gone wrong. On both sides, disillusionment set in. Months later, when Göring met Frank again at the Luftwaffe test center at Rechlin, he said lugubriously, "You still owe me an aircraft carrier." On October 9, 1939, IKG-30 were at last all together at Westerland on the island of Sylt. The CO, Captain Pohl, climbed out of his Ju-88 in a bad mood. Once again his unit had made a sortie against the British fleet, and again nothing had been achieved. He was called to the telephone. Göring wanted a personal report. Pohl answered bitterly, "We were just sent to an area where there was no enemy." This time more it had been a joint action with the Navy. A task force consisting of the battle cruiser Gneisenau, the cruiser Kohl, and 9 destroyers had gone out with the objective of luring the British home fleet from its bases into the North Sea. That done, the Luftwaffe was to have a go at it. This time, moreover, Lieutenant General Geisler's staff officers, his division had just been raised to the status of a corps, had made proper preparations. Instead of an attack by a few isolated aircraft, it was by IKG-30 and the whole of KG-26, reinforced by 2 groupings of LG-1. KG-1, known as Hindenburg, stood in reserve to deliver the coup de grace to a disabled enemy. Altogether, Geisler and his chief of staff, Major Harlinghausen, had committed 127 HE-118s plus 21 Ju-88s. Yet once more the operation ended as a flop. Most squadrons, after searching vainly for the enemy, returned to base with the last of their fuel. Others, notably IKG-30's 4 Squadron, claimed 10 bomb strikes on British cruisers, not one of which could be confirmed. Next morning, there was a big conference at the Reich Air Ministry in Berlin. These failures had to stop. Goring was angry. "I have another word to say to you, gentlemen. There was this matter of the Ark Royal." He looked challengingly around at his closest colleagues, at Milch, Secretary of State, Geschenach, Chief of General Staff, Beppo Schmidt, Chief of Air Intelligence, Udit, Quartermaster General, Kohler, Chief of the Fleet Air Arm, and many others. None of them had anything to say, but Captain Pohl had also been summoned to the meeting as commander of the only available U-88 unit. Now Goring turned directly to him. "Pohl," he said, "we've got to score a success. There are only a few British ships that stand in our way. The Repulse, the Renown, perhaps too the Hood, and of course the aircraft carriers. Once they are gone, the Scharnhorst and the Gneisenau can rule the waves." He went on to promise the earth, "I tell you now, every man who helps get rid of these ships will be awarded a house of his own and all the medals that are going." He concluded with some obscure tactical advice. "Do as we did in World War I against the enemy's aeroplanes. Am I right, Udit?" Udit smiled. He had scored 62 victories, Goring 22. Once again, the Iron One was giving way to arrogance. Pohl remarked, "Herr Generalfeldmarschall, it is the ambition of every air crew to destroy as many aircraft on a carrier as General Udit did in World War I." It made Goring happy. Pohl was dismissed from the meeting with smiles. From now on, his group was to stand at Westerland at constant readiness to deliver the knockout blow to the British fleet. But it was in fact the U-boats which scored the first real successes. Already on September 17th, the U-29 under Lieutenant Schuhart had sunk the British aircraft carrier Courageous west of Ireland. During the night of October 13th-14th, Lieutenant Preen's U-47 crept through the heavy defenses and entered the great naval base of Scapa Flow, a daring escapade that deserved even more than it achieved. Contrary to belief, the British home fleet was at sea, and all he found was the battleship Royal Oak. This he sank with 2 salvos of 3 torpedoes. However, this attack led indirectly 2 days later to an operation by U-88 dive bombers. For now ship movements off the east coast of Scotland were under constant watch by German air reconnaissance. On October 15th, a battlecruiser was sighted, presumed to be the Hood. Early next day, it was further reported to have entered the Firth of Forth. At 0930, Jeschonek gave his operations order on the telephone to Pohl in Westerland. He added, "I also have to convey to you a personal order from the Führer. It runs as follows. Should the Hood already be in dock when KG-30 reaches the Firth of Forth, no attack is to be made." Pohl said he understood. But Jeschonek continued urgently, "I make you personally responsible for acquainting every crew with this order. The Führer won't have a single civilian killed." There it was again, the concern to keep the war within bounds. Neither the Germans nor the British wanted to drop the first bombs on the other's homeland. So warships were the only legitimate targets, and then only so long as they were at sea. Once tied up, they were forbidden fruit, and military opportunity must give way to political considerations. For in Berlin it was still hoped that the conflict with Britain could soon be settled. At 1100 on October 16th, KG-30's bomber squadrons took off. By 12:15 they had reached the outer estuary of the Forth and started to push inland. We flew in loose section formation, for Department 5 of the Luftwaffe General Staff had informed us that no Spitfires were stationed in Scotland. Unfortunately for Pohl, this information was incorrect. British Fighter Command had based 2 Spitfire squadrons, numbers 602 and 603, at Turnhouse, near Edinburgh. Furthermore, that very morning a Hurricane squadron, number 607, had alighted at Drem, on the Firth's south bank. In the event of German bombers approaching, the fighters were to intercept them well out at sea, guided by the local radar station. As luck would have it, at lunchtime on this very day, the station suffered a power failure, and the Hurricanes and Spitfires only got the alarm when the drone of the Ju-88s was heard 12,000 feet above their bases. Valuable minutes had thus been lost, giving time for the bomber squadrons to seek out their targets in peace. As Pohl flew at the head of his scattered formation, Edinburgh came into view below. For the first time since the war began, a German bomber unit was flying over the United Kingdom. There was a great bridge separating the outer and inner Firth of Forth, and immediately beyond it, on the north bank, the docks at Rosyth Naval Base. At once Pohl spotted the ship that he had come to sink, distinguished by its length and much greater width from the smaller ships around it. It could only be the Hood, but she was no longer at sea, but in dock, or rather, in the sluice gate leading to it. She must have just arrived. She was a sitting target, Pohl reported, but orders robbed us of our prize. In spite of this, he put his machine into a dive. A number of cruisers and destroyers lay in Rothside roadstead, and he picked out one of the largest, the cruiser Southampton. The ack opened up in a frenzy of fire. Though his machine was shaken by explosions, Pohl imperturbably pressed home his attack, diving at an angle of nearly 80 degrees. Then it happened. First a short, sharp bang, followed by a cracking and tearing sound. Then an icy blast hit the crew's faces. The cabin roof had blown off at a speed of some 400 miles per hour. Pohl couldn't tell whether it was the result of a flak hit or whether the dive had exceeded the plane's limit of tolerance. The same fault had appeared during the Ju-318 flight tests at Rechlin, further evidence that the machine had been thrown into operations before its teething troubles were over. But he still kept control and dived on down with the Southampton plumb in his bomb sight. Some 3,000 feet up, he released his 1,000-pound bomb. It came clear away. It was later confirmed that the bomb struck the 9,100-ton cruiser amidships in the starboard superstructure, but it never went off. After penetrating 3 decks obliquely, it emerged again at the side of the ship and finally sank an Admiralty launch that was tied up against it. But the bomber crew had neither time nor opportunity to study the effect of their missile, for hardly had Pohl pulled out when his radio operator called out, "3 Spitfires are attacking!" It was too late to take avoiding action. Our port engine was hit at once and started smoking. I turned seawards, hoping to reach the German fishing cutter Hornerut, which the Navy had proposed to station at a given point off the Scottish coast during our attack. But the Spitfires came at him again. Against them, the U-88, the Wonder Bomber, with its single backwards-aiming MG-15, was a sitting duck. Machine gun bullets slammed into the cabin, and both radio operator and rear gunner were hit. Reaching Port Seaton, in East Lothian, Pohl pushed the machine right down to the water, but the Spitfires were still after him. At their third attack, the observer was also badly wounded, and now the starboard engine failed as well. "We were finished," Pohl said, describing these last dramatic moments. "I spied a trawler steaming north and thought perhaps I could still reach it." After that, I lost consciousness. It was a British fishing boat, and in a few minutes its men were on the spot with their dinghy. Pohl was the only one of his crew still alive, and they pulled him out before the aircraft sank. Later, the still unconscious German captain was transferred to a British destroyer. Only after 5 days did he regain consciousness in Port Edgar Hospital on the Firth's north bank. A second Ju-88 was also lost by IKG-30. Net result of the attack? The cruisers Southampton and Edinburgh, plus the destroyer Mohawk, suffered slight damage. The next morning, October 17th, 4 machines of the same unit, under its new commander, Captain Donch, took off again. This time the target lay even further away, Scapa Flow. In face of massive anti-aircraft fire, the 4 Ju-88s pushed right on to where the Royal Navy should be at anchor, but apart from the aged training-cum-depot ship Iron Duke, whose side was torn out by near misses, they found that the birds had flown. The British Admiralty had ordered their home fleet to withdraw to the Clyde, the approach to Glasgow on the west coast of Scotland. There their capital ships were well out of range, though they still needed only 1 extra day of cruising to either reach the North Sea or the North Atlantic approaches. The Royal Air Force attributed this withdrawal of the battle fleet to German attacks. Its official historian writes, "By 2 or 3 boldly executed strokes, and at a total cost of 4 aircraft, the German Air Force and the U-boat service between them scored a resounding strategic success." What about the RAF's own bombers? After trailing their coats at Wilhelmshaven on September 4th, would they now return to the assault?